Hi everyone, welcome to week 4. This week we're going to sort of give an introduction to Spinoza. Um, you might notice that for this week, I think that all of our readings actually are online and not pulled from the anthology. I think that part of the reason for this is because the texts that we're reading for this week are a little bit unusual. Really, what we're trying to do in this week is we want to introduce ourselves to Spinoza as a thinker. And part of the way that I've chosen to do that is by stressing his connection to Descartes. So we're going to read, we read some very late excerpts from Descartes from the Principles of Philosophy. And we're going to see how a lot of Spinoza's general framework occurs through certain modifications of concepts as they emerge in Descartes. So basically, we're just trying to see the connection between Descartes and the Meditations and the project of Spinoza. Because the thing that would normally happen in Descartes to Kant classes is that you would jump right into the Ethics, which is a book that we're going to read part of next week. Now that book is extremely difficult. It's quite hard, and it's written in a rather unusual way that we're going to talk about more next week. And so for me, I think that it might be easier to see the main point of what Spinoza is up to if we can really capture the way that he's building on Descartes. So that's why this week we're reading the Principles of Philosophy. We're reading Spinoza's treatise on the emendation of the intellect. Emendation is just like purifying. So the idea is you're going to purify your knowledge. And this might sound very similar to the Meditations. That's because it is. It is very similar to the Meditations. It's almost like Spinoza's attempt at writing his own version of the Meditations in some respects. The thing is that like the Meditations is like a finished project. The treatise on the emendation of the intellect is not a finished project. And you'll see whenever you read it, whether that's before or after watching this recording, that they are quite similar. They're both concerned with epistemological questions. They're both concerned with ways that we can come about knowing things and the general sort of metaphysical framework that Descartes was working with. Spinoza is very invested in that too. He actually even wrote an attempt to like reformulate strictly Cartesian principles earlier on in his youth. So he is very, very influenced by Descartes in that respect. And so, I've said at this point that I want to stress the connection between Descartes and Spinoza, but I think that one thing that's important to recognize about Spinoza is the degree to which he is a fan favorite of both like materialists, scientists, and mystics. That he somehow is able to appeal to. He was, I believe, Albert Einstein's favorite philosopher, for example, and he provides something like a philosophical framework that is adequate to modern physics, or at least that was his goal, but especially the physics that is propelled by mathematics. And so really, he is an extremely mathematical thinker. But he also is trying to think about the nature of God. And a lot of what Spinoza has to say about God, unlike Descartes, for example, is going to be extremely different than most typical conceptions of God. Just as one example, Descartes' conception of God, God has personality, which means that God has personhood. God is like us. God makes decisions about things. He's a lawgiver. He engages in moral judgment. He knows things, and so on and so forth. And so we can talk about God in basically the same way that we can talk about other human beings. God is a person, ultimately, like us, just an infinitely greater person. Now, for Spinoza, this is not an acceptable characterization of God. God doesn't have a will. God simply is nature, and this is exemplified in the Latin phrase "Deus sive natura." And the basic idea is that God is the sole substance of the world, and that everything that we think of as being objects within the world, that we might think of in Descartes' framework as like finite substances, all of those are just modifications of God. So that sounds like a very mystical idea, right? That God is sort of everything in the world. That there's no substantial separation between human beings and God, just simply because God is the substance that we all participate in. And so it's easy to see like why this would be very appealing for sort of like mystical religious figures, especially unorthodox religious thinkers. Spinoza himself was excommunicated from his Portuguese Jewish community because of his philosophical writings. And they didn't even have the Ethics, which is actually by far the most heretical, most unorthodox book that Spinoza ever wrote, and it was only published posthumously, I believe. So they didn't even have that. They only had, some of the stuff that still looks more traditional, more similar to Descartes, more similar to, kind of traditional monotheistic religions. But nonetheless, they were quite incensed with Spinoza. I'll tell the story that a few years ago I was at University of New Mexico, and they got this guy who was a Spinoza expert, Stephen Nadler, and he told this story about how Descartes, the Jewish community that Descartes was a part of, how severe his excommunication was. And he read off this description of somebody that had beaten a rabbi. Like they got into a fight, he beat the rabbi, and the censure, the punishment was like, okay, you can't go to church for 5 days, you need to pray, you need to ask for forgiveness, that sort of thing. So relatively light punishment, right? But here I have in front of me the text of. Okay, so sorry about that. That was an error. I have in front of me the text of Spinoza's excommunication. In it, they say, the lords of Ma'amad, i.e. the governing body of the six Parnasim and the Gabai, announced that having long known the evil opinions and acts of Baruch de Spinoza, they have endeavored by various means and promises to turn him from his evil ways. But having failed to make him mend his wicked ways, and on the contrary, daily receiving more and more serious information about the abominable heresies which he practiced, and taught about his monstrous deeds, and having for this numerous trustworthy witnesses who have deposed and borne witness to the effect in the presence of said Spinoza, they became convinced of the truth of this matter. And after all of this has been investigated in the presence of the Honorable Hakim, they have decided with their consent that the said Spinoza should be communicated and expelled from the people of Israel. By decree of the angels and by command of the holy men, we excommunicate, expel, curse, and damn Baruch de Spinoza with the consent of God, blessed be he, and with the consent of the entire holy congregation, in front of these holy scrolls with 613 precepts which are written therein, cursing him with the excommunication with which Joshua banned Jericho, and the curse with Elisha cursed the boys, and with all the castigations that are written in the book of law. Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down, and cursed be he when he rises up. Cursed be he when he goes out, and cursed be he when he comes in. The Lord will not spare him, but then the anger of the Lord and his jealousy shall smoke against that man, and all curses which are written in the book shall lie upon him, and the Lord shall blot out his name from under heaven. And the Lord will separate him unto evil and all the tribes of Israel according to all the curses of the covenant that are written in this book of law. But you that cleave unto the Lord your God are alive every day, one of you this day. Okay, so excessive, right? Like, all of the curses in the holy book, right, thrown at Spinoza. And so this is Spinoza's reputation for really hundreds of years, that he was, like, if you were accused of Spinozism, this was tantamount to being accused of being an atheist, because you're denying such important and essential aspects of religious orthodoxy. Okay, so that is just sort of like a general picture. Like, that's who we're trying to learn about, is this guy Spinoza, and we sort of have a general picture, but now we need to fill in the details. And in order to do that, we're going to start out with Descartes. And so this chart to the left, this is Descartes' understanding of substances and the principles of philosophy. It's important because here you can really see the motivation for what Spinoza is going to do. Descartes says, okay, well, I use the word substance in two senses. One sense of the word substance is that which, previously when we were talking about substances, our desire was to be able to talk about like things that persist through time. So like in the wax example, it's like all of the properties of the wax, its shape, its size, its color, its smell, so on. All of those properties can change, but the substance remains the same. And so the desire to give a definition or a discussion of substance is the desire to give an account of bodies or entities or whatever that persist with a relative kind of independence, right? Like, we want to know what is, for Descartes, we want to know what is the nature of that substance outside of its potential modifications. And his answer to that is that we can know strictly through the mind that the substance is, its nature is its extension. That's what doesn't change through the modification of all of the properties of the wax. But now we have to get a little bit more precise, right? Our desire to give an account of substance is our desire to give an account of the relative self-persistence of objects, right? What in them remains through the modification. And this is important too for thinking about our own identity too for Spinoza, right? Because bodies which are extended can always be divided, right? You can cut anything physical in half, whereas mental substances are not divisible, right? And that's what allows the soul to persist through the death of the body. But now we have to give a more precise account of substance. And so what that means is that we have to talk about the relative independence of substances. So Descartes says that finite substances, the sort of substances that he was talking about in the Meditations, the wax of the candle or the cogito, those are dependent on God. So they don't have an absolute or unqualified independence. They exist only by virtue of God's grace. And the idea behind that is that if we were able to exist without God, then God would not truly be all powerful, right? because there would be something that is not within his dominion or control. It would be the aspects of ourselves um, that are not regulated by God. So the persistence of every substance, every finite substance for Spinoza, depends ultimately on God. And so here's another funny story. Um, so Descartes thinks that the persistence of objects depends on the will of God. So since things are not the cause of their own essence, they require God in order to exist. So like the kind of perfection that they have, like that they take up space, or that you're minded, those qualities are given to you by God. God created the world. This is this sort of general Christian picture that Descartes is working with. But it's interesting because one of the conclusions that Descartes reaches because of this is that, yeah, that the persistence of even the entire world depends on the grace of God. That God just somehow decides basically to continue the existence of the universe, and that if one day he were to change his mind, then it would be over. And so essentially the role of prayer is to sort of beg God not to blink the universe out of existence. And there were people in monasteries that took Descartes very seriously and would devote hours and hours and hours of their lives, praying to God that he doesn't destroy the universe. So that's kind of crazy, right? That's an interesting case of a philosophy theory bleeding into actual practices of people that from a distance just seems completely crazy. I think. In any case, that aside, the point is just to say that finite substances, the sort of substances that individual bodies have or individual minds have, depend on God, who is the ultimate cause of those substances and is the only substance in the true sense, in the sense that he has an absolute kind of independence that is different, that doesn't depend on anything else. God is the being of every perfection, and so God is the cause of himself, unlike other finite things that are dependent on others for their existence. And so this picture is really interesting, right? You get a sense of where God fits in God's relationship to individual finite substances. But you also can see that the way that Descartes uses the word substance, he really sort of equivocates between these two uses. One, the absolute kind of substance, and one as this sort of relative finite kind of substance. And a lot of Spinoza's thinking really comes from trying to get rid of this equivocation. So instead of thinking about, instead of having a distinction where there's one true substance, but there are many finite substances, Spinoza will instead say there is only one substance, and that substance is God. And God is defined by being the cause of himself. And so then Spinoza will take up a picture where instead of calling these substances they have a relative kind of independence, Spinoza will instead call them modifications. Because God's creation, nature, cannot really be independent from God. God doesn't exist in a transcendent relationship to the world where he, in sort of traditional Christian imagery, it judges the world. He created the world, and so exists apart from it in heaven, or whatever sort of image that you have. For Spinoza, thinking through this relationship, the dependence of finite substances on the true nature of substance, leads him to believe that all of what we would, in the Cartesian framework, call finite substances are simply modifications of God. They're ways that God has sort of altered himself and taken on certain characteristics or properties. And so that's like a very interesting, difficult picture to understand. And so, just to point to a passage on letter 12 that was one of your online readings, on just the very first page, page 787. Spinoza distinguishes between two notions of the infinite. One notion of the infinite is infinite by virtue of its definition or its essence, and the other is infinite by virtue of its cause. So this is a little bit complex because we're trying to distinguish two different kinds of infinity. And ultimately, what we're going to see is that the kind of infinity that Spinoza is interested in is the kind of infinity that belongs to God, whereas the kind of infinity that he thinks is often confused for this true infinity is the sort of infinity that belongs to modifications of God, or finite, independent substances. That's what they were called in Descartes. Spinoza will be more careful and always just say that there's one substance and its various kinds of modification. Now, the difference is that God is essentially infinite, and finite substances are essentially infinite. So it does not belong to their essence to be infinite. So what does that mean? Descartes' notion of God is that God is causa sui, the cause of himself. Sui as in, in suicide, you're killing yourself. Causa, you're the cause of yourself. God is that which is the cause of himself. And this is the sense of God's infinity, that he's not like a finite thing that depends on anything else in order to exist. That his nature is to be infinite in the sense that there's no sense of dependence. Whereas finite substances, there can be like an infinite number of what we would before think about finite substances. So there might be like an uncountably large number of stars in the galaxy, or inches in the universe, or something like that, right? But this is infinite not because of its own nature, not because of it being, a body or a mind, but because it's countably part of an infinite collection of bodies and minds. And why are there an infinite number of bodies and minds? Ultimately, Spinoza is going to say that that's because of God. We're going to get a better picture of the details and his arguments for these things when we read the Ethics next week. But for now, we're just trying to get a picture of Spinoza's conception of the world and its basic motivations, so that then we can get more into the details when we cover the Ethics next week. And so, in saying that there are two kinds of infinity, Spinoza is trying to say that The true nature of reality, the ultimate nature of reality, is the kind of nature of reality that belongs with God as causa sui, but that we are apt to misunderstand the nature of this infinity by comparing it with the sort of infinity that we achieve at the level of modifications of God or finite substances. And one of the essential distinctions between these two kinds of infinity is that the kind of infinity that belongs to God is indivisible, right? Whereas the sort of infinity that belongs to finite substances, you can divide that infinity into smaller infinities. It might be interesting for those of you who know like a lot of mathematics to think about this conception of the infinite and its relationship to like Cantor. A lot of philosophers of mathematics were very interested in doing that. Okay, and so part of the way in which Spinoza is a rationalist in the way of Descartes, and perhaps an even more extreme rationalist than Descartes, is his sense that the way that we come to know about the world is strictly through the kind of knowledge that we get through thinking about God as a substance. And that the mistakes that we make are typically mistakes that come from trying to think about God as an infinite substance, as being like a finite substance, or being like a modification of God. You're not thinking about God's essence, you're thinking about just how God manifested himself or itself or herself, themselves, in a particular case, and unduly extrapolating from that case. And so what we need to do is we need to think about purely rational knowledge of the sort that we get from thinking about God than the kind that we get from thinking about finite substances. And so this is a nice way to transition to some of the themes in the treatise on the emendation of the intellect. And so that is some of the stuff that I put on this side of the board. You might notice that the treatise on the emendation of the intellect is a lot like the Meditations. And really, that's because it genuinely is basically a very similar epistemological project to the Meditations, which is why it's so interesting to read them together. Is that both of them, and Spinoza's is clearly modeled after Descartes, both of them are an attempt to think about how can we purify the kind of knowledge we have? How can we be certain that the sort of things that we know are correct, do reflect the nature of reality, and get rid of the sort of beliefs that are false beliefs that lead us astray in various respects. And so this essay from Spinoza is interesting, and it's similar to Descartes too, because they both sort of talk about practical things too. Like Spinoza talks about, well, if you're concerned too much with material things, then that's gonna mess up your reasoning processes. You're gonna become too attached to like money or riches or sensual pleasures, and you'll deceive yourself in order to get them. And so there are sort of like interesting practical reflections on method. But the thing that I want to highlight or isolate for the purposes of this lecture is his account of the ways that we come to know things. Because he lists ultimately 4 ways that we come to know things, and he lists them in order of ascending strength. So we start out with the weakest kind of knowledge that we can possibly have, and then we move to the most fundamental kind of knowledge that we can have. And so just in case you can't read my handwriting or there's a glare or something, the first kind of knowledge, the weakest kind of knowledge, is testimonial knowledge. This is knowledge that we get from other people. And Spinoza's example of this is his parents' birthday, right? That's not the sort of thing that he could ever experience for himself. And so he just goes by the hearsay of others for this kind of knowledge. And then we have perception. And you might notice that there's intuition here as well. And a lot of philosophers use perception and intuition in a virtually interchangeable way. What they mean is just what we normally mean by perceptual knowledge, which is you sense something, right? You see something, smell something, hear something, touch something, taste something, right? That's what it means to perceive. And that's what Spinoza means by perception as well. But it's importantly not what he means by intuition. Okay, and so then we have this distinction between intuition and reason. This is a little bit complex, but this is basically like what Descartes was saying in terms of the difference between the cogito argument and other clear and distinct ideas. Is one thing you know immediately, and the other thing you know by virtue of the inferences that you can make from that immediate kind of knowledge. So the cogito is something that we know immediately. There's no inference that is needed to know the cogito. You know the cogito, you know that you exist because you're thinking, and that's an immediate kind of knowledge. Whereas reason is where you make inferences from that kind of knowledge. And that's why reason was rendered dubious by the evil demon, but intuition was not. The cogito was able to dispel the evil demon, but mathematics, that sort of reasoning, is not able to do so. And so one way that Spinoza is a rationalist rather than an empiricist is that he wants to say that the kind of knowledge that we get through pure reason, and his hallmark for intuitive knowledge is mathematical knowledge, right? So to know that 2 plus 3 equals 5, that's something that you don't know because you know other things about the world. It's something that you know in virtue of just seeing the mathematical fact. And so in that way, Spinoza believes, unlike Descartes, that mathematical knowledge is often a form of intuitive knowledge, that you know it just because you're seeing directly into the essence of the numbers 2, 3, 5, addition, right? Like you are gaining a sort of direct and intellectual intuition. Intellectual in the sense that it's based purely on the mind and the mind's knowledge, right? And so what's important is that for Spinoza, testimony and perception, this belongs to knowledge of the existence of stuff, right? When you perceive something, you see it there. You see that it exists in a particular spatiotemporal location. Whereas when you're reasoning, using reason alone, or using your intuitive knowledge, your ability to see into the nature of reality, this is your knowledge of the essence of things. And this is going to be important because basically what Spinoza's picture of the world is going to say is that God is the cause of the essence of everything. And this is the sense that everything is dependent on God. Is that God is the source of the structure of the universe, but that the existence of modifications of God, so the existence of like me, is ultimately caused by other modifications of God. So like I exist because my parents existed, right? But all of us exist only by virtue of God. And so I hope that this has been helpful in terms of getting like a general picture of Spinoza's philosophy. The desire is that we can like kind of be the modification or the part of God that can know him, her, it, themselves, right? And so we can be like a particularly powerful aspect or modification of God. Um, and that we do that through the use of reason. And that this allows us to know the essence of things in the way that God created them. And so to have a knowledge that is the highest kind of knowledge because it's the most ultimate form of knowledge. It's the least susceptible to modification, and it is the most essential. It stems the most from the fundamental nature of the universe. And so testimony and perception, these are weak sources of knowledge. They can only tell us that things exist at certain spaces or times, but it can't tell us what the nature of that existence is. Whereas reason and intuition, this is the way that we can sort of understand God, be the part of God, the modification of God that knows himself. So we're going to get into a lot of the more specific arguments for this conception, this picture of the world. But I hope that what this lecture has helped you do is just sort of get an in to know what Spinoza's general picture of reality is like. And really, I think that one metaphor that's very helpful is to think about an ocean, right? There's a sense that in the ocean, every drop has its own individuality in a certain sense, under certain conditions, but that viewed otherwise, you can see sort of the ocean as a whole and see how the individual droplets in the ocean are modifications of like the ocean's movement and how they are ultimately caused by the larger body that they're a part of. That's basically Spinoza's image of God as being the ocean, the fundamental substance that we are all only modifications of. And so, yeah, we'll dig into the ethics next week. Have a good week.